Aulus Postumius Albinus, Praetor 110 BCE. The younger brother of the consul of 110, it was in fact Aulus Postumius Albinus who led Roman forces to one of the most humiliating military defeats in Rome's entire history, thus securing his brother's exile. Aulus is historically significant for all the wrong reasons. He is a Roman general who led his men under the yoke to a foreign adversary, and even more shockingly, he also lost a marching camp to the enemy. We'll discuss why those two things are so historically almost unique, and how Aulus must literally be one of, if not the worst generals in all of Roman history to have to suffer both of those fates. In my previous two videos on Bestia and Spurius Postumius Albinus, I talked about how the Jugurthine War did not reveal Rome in a positive light, and how it was effectively Rome's Vietnam in terms of exposing the weaknesses of Rome's institutions and the individuals who ran them. If Spurius Postumius Albinus suffered the most on a personal level from the interactions with Jugurtha, then I think it's safe to say that the person who revealed himself to be the most lacking was his younger brother, Aulus Postumius Albinus. In this video, we're going to be dunking on Aulus throughout the entire length of the video, but there's really not much else you can do when you look at the facts of Aulus's life and think about the impact of everything that he did. As we'll see also, his end was extraordinarily fitting, and you couldn't write a better ending for this guy. So let's get into this and see the life of one of the least talented men to ever grace this list. As with his brother Spurius, Aulus hailed from the patrician gens Postumia, and as a member of the Albinus branch, he was part of the most prominent sub-branch of the family. Anytime you are from a patrician family, your success in life is more or less guaranteed. Not all patricians were created equal, but as a patrician, your marriage matches and political prospects were pretty much always secure. Your family had to keep up a certain amount of wealth, but apparently the Albinus branch had no difficulties there, since they had two sons who went on to achieve high office, and at the same time, no less. That must have been a very expensive year, since both Spurius and Aulus were holding high offices they had to campaign for. Albinus translates from Latin as whitish, so this could also mean something like little white or something like that. It's not too significant. We don't really know where this would have come from, or what the reason was for there being a branch of the family called whitish. Maybe this line of the family was known for being pale. Who knows? The father of this unfortunate duo was most likely Spurius Postumius Albinus Magnus, the consul of 148. That's not something that we can prove definitively, but it seems rather likely. Aulus had an older brother, the consul of 110, Spurius Postumius Albinus, and given that both of them were most likely following the traditional cursus honorum, this means that Spurius was most likely 3 years the senior of Aulus. If Spurius held the consulship in his year, that is to say the year he turned 42, then this would make Aulus 39 at the time of the Jugurthine War, and it would mean that he would have been born around 149 or so BCE. The Jugurthine War officially began in 111 during the consulship of Lucius Calpurnius Bestia. Bestia had led his army into Numidia, laid waste several towns, and compelled Jugurtha to surrender. However, that surrender agreement was accompanied by at least some accusations of bribery, and the deal had been rejected by the Senate. A tribune in Rome had then called for hearings to have Jugurtha point out all the men whom he had bribed, and then punish those men for betraying the Republic's trust. That trial had fallen through due to the machinations of allies of men like Bestia. Going into 110, the war would enter its second year. At this time, there was no reason to think that Roman arms wouldn't prevail eventually. Rome had won all of the engagements during 111, and the Roman army was vastly superior to that which could be mustered by the Numidians. However, it is worth noting that Numidia was a large area, and that its towns were quite spread out, so even if Rome's victory were inevitable, this would still be a long drawn-out process, and it doesn't appear that all that many Roman commanders were eager for such a task. In the year 110, Spurius Postumius Albinus was elected consul, and Aulus, his younger brother, was elected praetor the same year. The lot fell to Spurius to lead his consular army into Africa to replace Bestia, and Aulus, as his brother, would accompany him as a second-in-command and chief lieutenant. Political developments in Rome dictated that the new consul was expected to seek a decisive outcome. Bestia was accused of holding back in order to extract bribes from Jugurtha. This was the result of several years of Jugurtha interfering with the natural order of things in Numidia to overthrow his nephews and seize power. Rome was officially allied with the nephews, but Jugurtha was able to get more favorable treatment from Rome through generous bribery. The whole populace was aware of this by now, and they weren't having it. The tribunes kept firing up the people to hold their leaders accountable, and this seems to have been a case where the Senate was ashamed of itself enough that they didn't really try to stop the tribunes from exposing the corruption of some of their colleagues. Any Roman commander who was insufficiently aggressive, therefore, would be seen as corrupt based on Rome's past experiences with Jugurtha. And as we'll see, Spurius would have that problem because he was not what we would call a good or energetic commander. Let's try to imagine Spurius's campaign from the perspective of his younger brother Aulus. The general outline of Spurius's efforts to attack Jugurtha were that he would enter Numidia and corner Jugurtha at some town or other. Jugurtha would realize that he was overmatched. He would begin to offer his surrender. Negotiations would start, but then Jugurtha would back out, claiming that the Romans were engaging in perfidy and were about to betray him, launch a counterattack in order to restore the morale of his own men, and then fall back to another town. Spurius Albinus would then lead his men to that town. The process would start over, and this played out several times in a row over the course of the campaigning season until it was time for Spurius Albinus to go home to oversee elections. Aulus apparently was not pleased by this, and he thought that his brother was conducting the campaign poorly. Most likely, Aulus was driven by some kind of filial regard and didn't want his brother to get into trouble for conduct that he knew would not go over well in Rome. On the other hand, Aulus was undoubtedly quite ambitious in his own right, and he wanted to exceed his brother. Speculation in Rome did begin about Spurius Albinus' allegiance due to his lack of success and sluggish movement in Africa. People assumed that he must be taking bribes, he couldn't just be a bad general. But Sallust, the historian, clearly does think that the truth about the Albinus brothers is that they were just not very good at commanding men in battle. The truth of it is hard to establish, of course, but I tend to agree with Sallust on this point. When Albinus had to go home in order to oversee the elections, he left his younger brother Aulus in charge, and this would prove to be the undoing of Spurius Postumius Albinus. It occurs to me now that I look at my own slide that there were two fateful decisions rather than one. The first fateful decision was when Spurius left his brother Aulus in charge of an army for winter. The second fateful decision is when Aulus decided to campaign against Jugurtha and seek a decisive engagement on his own. Sallust characterizes Aulus simply as a conceited ignoramus. I imagine that Sallust is able to not only draw on the events of this war, but on a later anecdote from 20 or so years later when Aulus gets himself into similar difficulties. We'll come to that when it is relevant, of course. Despite bad weather, which I assume in the context of modern Tunisia must mean more like coldish rain than something like snow, Aulus marched out of winter quarters and decided to march on the fortified town of Suthul, where Jugurtha stored his treasury. This was a pretty bold move, and it was designed to force Jugurtha to fight. Aulus apparently thought that seizing the initiative in this way would be unexpected and would give him the initiative. Unfortunately for Aulus, the town of Suthul was one of the strongest points that Jugurtha held. It was simply too strong to assault. One part of it faced a steep cliff, so it was effectively immune from attack from that angle, and a lot of the rest of the city faced a swampy plain, which meant that it was a bad ground from which to try to camp or mount siege equipment or anything like that. So Suthul would be a hard nut to crack if Aulus were to press an assault or try to besiege it in the conventional way. Not to mention that Jugurtha had settled into winter quarters and presumably had provisions to last through winter, whereas Aulus had broken winter quarters and most likely would have some logistical challenges. Jugurtha, however, had no interest in remaining at Suthul, and he took his army out and marched around the Roman force through some wooded hills. When Aulus's scouts detected Jugurtha's army, he gave chase, just as Jugurtha wished. Jugurtha's plan was to go back to his oldest trick in the book when it came to dealing with Romans and engaging in bribery. This time, rather than trying to win over key senators, Jugurtha focused his attention on junior officers in the ranks of the army. He began to offer bribes to both Roman and auxiliary officers if they would defect or at least fail to do their duty when the time came. It's unclear exactly how much of his plan he disclosed to these men as he was bribing them, but apparently he was able to bribe them quite successfully, and they knew exactly when they were expected to perform their obligations to their new paymaster. Later evidence that I've alluded to before, and that we're not going to talk about yet, from about 20 years after this event, suggests that Aulus was not only arrogant in the way that Sallust puts it forward, but that he was especially harsh on men under his command. So it's very possible that what we see here is not so much the corruption of the Roman people or the incompetence of the army as a whole, but rather just Aulus being an incredibly unlikable commander who was so bad that his men were willing to literally betray Rome in order to escape being under his thumb. At any rate, though, many men in the camp, including some very high-ranking people, were willing to accept Jugurtha's bribes, and it looks like their primary motivation was most likely just sheer hatred of their commander. Sallust's narrative makes it out as if they were just greedy, but I think that there's a little more going on than that. Having won over enough supporters from the Roman camp, Jugurtha put his plan into action. I can't help but feel that one of the other factors involved in the decision of many Romans to abandon their own banners and fight with Jugurtha is that Aulus's decision to leave winter camp prematurely most likely meant that these guys were going hungry and maybe Jugurtha had more food. Certainly he would have had more access to food given the mobility of his army. At any rate, let's not speculate too much further about the motives of the men who decided to turn traitor. Let's focus on the betrayal itself, since I think this is actually more historically significant. In accordance with previous arrangements, one cohort of Ligurians and 2 squadrons of Thracian cavalry, these of course would have been auxiliary troops, along with a handful of Roman privates, defected to the Numidians outright when the Numidians surrounded the camp. Having the camp surrounded would not in itself have inspired panic. The Roman marching camps, the ones they dug every night, were more or less immune from direct assault because they were compact and they were regular. Romans knew exactly where they were supposed to be in these camps, and they knew exactly how to defend them. Even Romans during times of civil war were not able to seize the camps of other Romans because this design was so effective. However, when men started simply leaving the camp and joining the enemy, this spread panic. This is not something that was supposed to happen. They didn't train for this. So the remaining Romans, at this point they would have been deprived of most of their auxiliaries, tried to circle the wagons. However, one of the other men who was on the take from Jugurtha was the chief centurion of the 3rd Legion, and he controlled a section of the rampart, which would have been a pretty significant section, and he simply stood aside and let the Numidians pour into camp. Once they saw the Numidians inside of their camp and they realized that some of their own fellow Romans had betrayed them, not just their barbarian auxiliaries, the Romans broke, panicked, and fled to a nearby hill. The Numidians didn't pursue, they didn't have to. Many of the Romans who fled dropped their arms, so most of the Romans who reassembled under Aulus on the hill were more or less unarmed. What's really historically significant about this is that this is perhaps the only instance of a Roman camp being successfully overrun by a foreign foe. It's often said that Roman camps were literally invincible, but I wonder if a lot of people are forgetting about this instance or if they discount it because of the treachery involved. Nonetheless, I think it counts, and this is an instance which shows that given the right circumstances, nothing is impossible. Especially if you have a really bad general there. Bad generals have a real genius for making the impossible possible. The next morning, Jugurtha offered terms of surrender to Aulus. We have to remember Aulus's situation. His men were exposed to the elements now that they were deprived of their camp. They would have had no provisions, or if they did have any provisions at all, it would just be whatever someone was carrying on their person. They were demoralized. They had suffered a basically unprecedented defeat by having their camp overrun, and many of them didn't even have their weapons. Numidia is a big area. They don't know it that well. It is not their home. They've lost a lot of their auxiliaries, and Roman legions often relied on their auxiliaries for light troops who would provide scouting and flank support. So they had no other option but to surrender. The fact that Jugurtha offered the surrender rather than massacring them was a gift, really, if we're being honest. One of Jugurtha's terms, however, was almost equally unprecedented, or if not unprecedented, then at least extraordinarily rare and rather archaic. Jugurtha forced the Romans to pass under the yoke before he would allow them to be safely conducted back to the Roman province of Africa. What is unprecedented about this is that it's the first time that Romans have been forced to pass under the yoke since the defeat at Caudine Forks at the hands of the Samnites all the way back in 321 BCE. That is to say that not only did Aulus in one event manage to have his camp overrun for probably the first and only time in Roman history, but then he went on to be the first Roman commander to lead men under a yoke in 210 years. So, again, Aulus is historically significant, but for all the wrong reasons. The news of Aulus's defeat reached Rome, and Spurius was unable to convince the Senate to allow him to bring reinforcements. He, of course, himself hurried back to Numidia, thinking he'd be able to salvage the situation in person, but the army was simply too shattered for the campaign to be resumed. Many of the senators in Rome, of course none of them were there, but most of them had military experience. The consensus among them is that Aulus should not have passed under the yoke, but rather have cut his way back to Numidia. The fact of the matter is that if we really think about the circumstances of what had happened, that's a quite idiotic take on the situation. If your men are mostly unarmed, if they're completely demoralized, if you have no baggage train, and it's the middle of winter so it's hard to live off the land, trying to cut your way back to your lines through a large territory that doesn't have very many cities would be a suicide mission and a waste of an army. I don't know the size of Aulus's army, but if I had to guess, just based on what I've seen similar armies be when the numbers are given, I would guess perhaps he had around 20,000 men. Now, for some of the Romans, perhaps it would be worth the loss of 20,000 men to avoid the humiliation of passing under a yoke. But of course, none of the men who were making that complaint were actually present. I think Aulus made the right decision once he was betrayed to sacrifice his dignity rather than lose 20,000 men or whatever number he had under his command. However, there are usually repercussions for failure, but usually those repercussions do not redound to elites, at least in the Roman world. Most Roman generals were held more or less innocent of any military defeats. And in the case of Aulus, that was true. He was never prosecuted or punished in any way for his incompetence. At the bare minimum, in the political context in which he lived, he did prove that he was an enemy to Jugurtha, and he did his utmost to fight him. He failed, but he did try. Another thing that happened in North Africa is that the two brothers were not even able to establish discipline over the army because they had lost all credibility with their own men, and they weren't even able to prevent their men from harassing the locals. The only thing they could do was to make the men move camp every once in a while to avoid creating unsanitary conditions at the latrines. Spurius went on to hand over command to his successor, Metellus Numidicus, and the two brothers went home. As I mentioned, Aulus could not be prosecuted because there was no accusation of bribery against him. But because of Spurius's slowness early in the campaign, the Romans were quite suspicious that he had been on the take from the king in Numidia. Spurius was prosecuted for taking bribes from Jugurtha and Sallust, and the historian Sallust, suggests the real reason was not that Spurius had taken any kind of bribery, but rather that there was general anger at the nobles going back 20 or so years to the time of the Gracchi, and that there was more specific anger at Aulus's great defeat. That even the common people of Rome, many of whom had served at one time or another in the legions, felt personally humiliated by the fact that Romans had been forced to go under the yoke. Aulus's failure ensured that the war with Jugurtha would drag on for more time, that it would drag on for years and become the quagmire it always had the potential to be, and that it would be a stain on the reputation of the Roman army. I can't help but to think that the combination of Aulus's defeat and then the later Gallic invasions of northern Italy, which resulted in the loss of an army or two, combined to show the weaknesses of Rome's levied legion system and contributed in no small part to the Marian reforms, which created the professional standing legions. Spurius Albinus most likely died in exile, a stranger in a strange land. His brother, however, as I mentioned, could not really be prosecuted for anything, and none of the censors over the next 20 years saw fit to remove him from the list of the Senate. After all, he was loyal, even if he was incredibly stupid. Aulus Albinus was still alive and able-bodied during the Social War 20 years later, from 91 to 88. During that time, Rome saw almost all of its allies revolt, and it found itself in a struggle for survival. It needed anyone and everyone who was able to command troops in the field, and this meant turning to even Aulus Albinus of all people. In 89, Aulus found himself cooperating with Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Aulus was commanding a fleet off the coast of Campania, while Sulla led an army through the region, and the two tried to capture towns in conjunction with one another. The senior man would have been Sulla despite his youth, because Sulla by this point was a consul, or at least about to become one. Aulus was tasked with blockading the resort town of Pompeii, while Sulla besieged it from the land. However, Aulus was able to somehow offend the Hirpini under his command. This was a group of Samnites who remained loyal to the Romans rather than joining with the Socii for whatever reason, that the Hirpini decided to stone him to death. The nature of his offense is unknown, but apparently he hadn't really learned much from his time in Africa and from his great humiliation. When someone is incredibly rich and sheltered, it turns out that they can often afford to ignore all of the lessons that they may learn in life and to pretend that they don't have any major character flaws. That is as true now as it was then, and apparently Aulus Albinus was not aware that he needed to work on his people skills. This, of course, cost him his life. To add insult to injury, Sulla declined to punish these men. He looked at the situation objectively. He knew that the Herpini, as soldiers, were far more valuable to him than a washed-up, failed commander from 20 years before. He just pretended that the whole thing never happened and moved on with his life. Later, of course, Sulla became dictator and also won victories in the east over Mithridates. So things worked out for Sulla, but not so much for Aulus Albinus. Interesting side note, it was to a large extent the sheer incompetence of Aulus Albinus, which, as I mentioned, prolonged the war in Numidia, and that was ultimately what allowed Sulla to become as famous as he was and to launch his career. Sulla famously was the guy who arranged the capture of Jugurtha while he was a mere quaestor. This also set in motion his great rivalry with Marius, who was his commanding officer at the time. So, the actions of Aulus Albinus had some deep resonances, and it is quite fitting that the man whose career he indirectly made held him in such contempt and refused to avenge his death or even investigate it. As I've said before, there are two categories of men who tend to impact history the most: men who have great ability and men who possess great stupidity. Aulus Postumius Albinus was very clearly a member of the latter category. When someone is exceptionally untalented, they have the ability to impact history in an outsized way. Aulus's conduct in Africa ensured that the Jugurthine War fulfilled its Vietnam potential. As I've mentioned in these videos, this war was absolutely ruinous for the reputations of many important Romans in the Senate. However, I would be remiss if I failed to mention that many Roman soldiers lost their lives due to a war that easily could have been avoided or concluded much more easily. And that is in part where the anger comes from when it comes to the people of Rome, who consistently demanded accountability for the interactions with Jugurtha. The conduct of Aulus as a general and of his men in battle reveals some shortcomings of the Roman levied legion system. This system of conscription was no longer as effective as it had been. There were no longer the great veterans of the Second Punic War really providing a core to build around. A lot of the men in the ranks had never participated in a real war, even some of the veterans among them. They had never fought an opponent that was formidable. Rome's legions simply were not quite as good as they had been. They were less professional, less experienced, less disciplined. Their commanders were also less experienced as a consequence. Rome had not had any real equals in decades. Aulus Postumius Albinus seems to have been the first and only Roman defeated in camp by a barbarian assault, and the first Roman commander in over 200 years forced to pass under a yoke. These are not the kinds of accomplishments that you want to flash up on your screen while you're playing Xbox, but when they do flash up, they will be stored on your player profile forever. And there's no getting around that. Aulus Albinus is a special boy, but not for reasons that he would ever choose. Finally, when Sulla casually disregarded Aulus's murder, it's incredibly striking. As I said, it's the most fitting end for someone as counterproductive as Aulus Albinus, but it's also especially striking given that Sulla's political posturing and all of his legislation was him acting as a champion of all patricians and also of the men who were at the top of the Senate. He was an elitist par excellence, and it should come as a little bit of a surprise that he held Aulus Albinus in such contempt, since Albinus was very clearly an elitist. This is someone who had no respect for the men under his command. He was a patrician and apparently damn proud of it. And he was someone that you would have to uphold as being at least on some level competent in order to uphold the corporate competency of the ruling class. If you want to argue that all men who come from certain families are capable of ruling by virtue of their wealth and their family connections, then Aulus Albinus seems like someone that you have to rehabilitate on some level. But Sulla didn't even bother. And I think that also tells us a good deal about Sulla, because Sulla is someone who was absolutely self-centered and cold-hearted. And this is one instance where the cold-bloodedness of Sulla has some comedic value, because I really can't blame him for just leaving Aulus out to dry. No doubt the Herpini were more valuable to the war effort than Aulus Albinus. So far as I know, Sulla didn't bring this matter up later and try to prosecute the Herpini after the war. He didn't think it was worthwhile. And he was right.